Flight attendant slapped black mom holding baby, didn't know her husband owned the airline. The morning sun filtered through the airport windows as Amara Jackson adjusted her 6-month-old son Isaiah in her arms while waiting at gate B-12 for her flight to Chicago. She had dressed carefully that morning in a simple navy dress and comfortable flats, knowing that traveling alone with a baby required practical choices over fashion statements. Isaiah gurgled happily, his tiny fingers wrapped around the edge of his favorite blue blanket that his grandmother had knitted for him before she passed away 3 months ago. Amara checked her boarding pass one more time, confirming her seat assignment in first class, a gift from her husband who always insisted she travel comfortably when flying with their son. The gate area buzzed with the usual pre-flight energy as business travelers typed furiously on laptops and families corralled children near the windows to watch planes taxi on the tarmac. The boarding announcement came over the speakers, and Amara gathered her diaper bag, careful to keep Isaiah secure against her chest as she joined the first-class boarding line. She noticed a few sideways glances from other passengers, the kind of looks she had grown accustomed to over the years, the subtle double-takes when people saw a young black woman boarding in the premium cabin. Behind her, a man in an expensive suit muttered something to his companion about people gaming the system these days, but Amara kept her eyes forward, focusing on Isaiah's peaceful breathing and the warmth of his small body against hers. The gate agent scanned her boarding pass with a professional smile, and Amara walked down the jet bridge, her footsteps echoing in the enclosed space as she made her way toward the aircraft door where flight attendant Patricia Summers stood greeting passengers with what appeared to be a practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. Patricia Summers had been working for Atlas Airlines for 12 years, and she prided herself on maintaining what she called standards in first class. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her uniform was pressed to military precision, every detail perfectly in place as she evaluated each passenger boarding her aircraft. When she saw Amara approaching with Isaiah, her smile tightened imperceptibly, and she made a mental note to keep an eye on seat 2A throughout the flight. Patricia had seen what she considered these situations before, people who somehow managed to get upgraded or use miles for first-class tickets but didn't really belong there, and she considered it her duty to ensure they didn't disrupt the experience for the real first-class passengers. As Amara stepped into the aircraft, Patricia's greeting was noticeably cooler than it had been for the businessman who had boarded just before her, a subtle shift in tone that Amara recognized but chose to ignore as she navigated toward her seat with Isaiah beginning to fuss slightly from the change in environment. Settling into seat 2A proved challenging as Isaiah had started crying, the unfamiliar sounds and pressure changes affecting his sensitive ears. Amara reached into her diaper bag for his pacifier, speaking to him in soft, soothing tones while other passengers filed past her seat. She could feel their stares, some sympathetic but many annoyed at the prospect of sharing their premium cabin space with a crying baby. An older woman across the aisle made a loud comment to her husband about how some people have no consideration for others, while a businessman in the row behind dramatically put on his noise-canceling headphones with an exaggerated sigh. Amara continued to comfort Isaiah, gently bouncing him while humming a lullaby her mother had sung to her as a child, the same melody that usually calmed him during difficult moments. Patricia appeared at her seat within minutes, her expression stern and her voice carrying a sharp edge as she spoke loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear clearly. "Ma'am, you need to control your child immediately, or I'll have to ask you to move to a more appropriate seating area," Patricia announced, her hands on her hips in a posture that suggested authority and impatience. Amara looked up at her, keeping her voice calm and measured despite the flush of embarrassment creeping up her neck. "He's just adjusting to the cabin pressure, and I'm doing my best to soothe him. He usually settles within a few minutes once we're seated." Patricia's eyes narrowed, and she leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper that somehow still carried to nearby passengers. "Listen, I don't know how you got this seat, but first-class passengers expect a certain level of comfort and quiet. If you can't provide that, you don't belong here." The words stung, but Amara maintained her composure, continuing to rock Isaiah while meeting Patricia's gaze steadily. "I purchased this ticket like everyone else here, and my son will calm down shortly. Perhaps you could offer some assistance instead of threats." The suggestion seemed to inflame Patricia further, her face reddening as she straightened up and raised her voice even louder. "Don't tell me how to do my job," Patricia snapped, her professional facade cracking completely as she gestured dramatically toward the back of the plane. "I've been doing this for 12 years, and I know when someone is out of their element. You and that screaming brat are disturbing everyone in this cabin, and I won't stand for it." Isaiah's cries had actually begun to subside, responding to his mother's gentle ministrations, but Patricia seemed beyond noticing as she continued her tirade. Several passengers had pulled out their phones, sensing drama unfolding, and began recording what they assumed would be another viral video of an unruly passenger being put in their place by airline staff. The businessman behind Amara nodded approvingly at Patricia's stance, muttering loudly enough to be heard, "Finally, someone taking control of the situation. These people always think they can do whatever they want." Amara felt tears pricking at her eyes, not from sadness but from the sheer frustration of being publicly humiliated while simply trying to travel with her child. She took a deep breath, determined not to give them the reaction they seemed to be expecting, and spoke with quiet dignity that commanded attention despite its softness. "My son is 6 months old and has every right to travel just as every other passenger on this plane," Amara said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands as she adjusted Isaiah's blanket. "If you have a problem with families flying in first class, perhaps you should reconsider your career choice in customer service." The cabin fell silent for a moment, even Isaiah's whimpers fading as if he sensed the tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. Patricia's face contorted with rage at being challenged in front of what she considered her domain, her authority questioned by someone she had already dismissed as unworthy of respect. Without warning, her hand shot out and connected with Amara's cheek with a sharp crack that echoed through the first-class cabin like a gunshot. The slap was so unexpected, so shocking in its violence, that for a moment nobody moved or spoke, frozen in a tableau of disbelief as Amara's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow. Isaiah began screaming in earnest now, responding to his mother's distress and the sudden violence that had shattered the relative calm of the boarding process. The sound of Isaiah's terrified crying finally broke the spell, and phones appeared from every direction, capturing the aftermath of the assault as Amara slowly turned her face back toward Patricia, a red handprint already forming on her dark skin. Instead of retaliating or screaming or any of the reactions the watching passengers might have expected, Amara simply held her son closer and reached for her phone with her free hand. Her movements were deliberate and calm, a stark contrast to the chaos Patricia had created, and she selected a contact from her favorites list before putting the call on speaker. The phone rang once, twice, and then a deep male voice answered with obvious concern, "Honey, is everything okay? You should be boarding now." Amara's voice was steady but carried an undercurrent of controlled emotion as she replied, "Daniel, I'm having some trouble on the flight. The flight attendant just physically assaulted me in front of our son." The silence that followed was deafening, and Patricia's face began to pale as she noticed the name on Amara's phone screen, Daniel Mitchell, CEO Atlas Airlines. "Which flight attendant?" Daniel's voice had transformed from concerned husband to corporate executive in an instant, each word carrying the weight of absolute authority. "And are you and Isaiah physically safe right now?" Amara kept her eyes on Patricia as she answered, watching the flight attendant's expression cycle through disbelief, fear, and desperate denial. "Her name tag says Patricia Summers, and she slapped me when I suggested she help rather than threaten to remove us from first class. We're safe now, but Isaiah is terrified, and I have a room full of witnesses who've been recording everything." The sound of rapid typing came through the speaker, followed by multiple voices in the background as Daniel apparently mobilized his entire executive team. "Patricia Summers, 12-year employee, assigned to Flight 447 to Chicago." Daniel's voice carried deadly calm. "I'm looking at her personnel file right now, and this isn't her first complaint regarding passenger treatment. Patricia, I know you can hear me. You've just assaulted the wife of the CEO of Atlas Airlines in front of approximately 40 witnesses, many of whom are currently live streaming this interaction." The color drained completely from Patricia's face as the implications crashed over her like a tidal wave. Her legs began to shake, and she grabbed the nearest seat back for support while passengers around the cabin gasped and murmured in shock. The phones that had been recording what they thought was a justified confrontation were now capturing the complete destruction of a career in real time. The businessman who had been supporting Patricia moments earlier was frantically trying to delete his social media posts, but screenshots were already spreading across the internet faster than he could manage damage control. The elderly woman who had complained about crying babies was sliding down in her seat, trying to become invisible as her earlier comments echoed in her memory. Daniel's voice continued through the speaker, each word measured and precise. "Captain Morrison, this is Daniel Mitchell. I need you to return to the gate immediately. Federal law enforcement is en route to arrest Patricia Summers for assault. She is to be detained by air marshals until they arrive." Captain Morrison's voice crackled over the intercom, professional but clearly shaken by the unprecedented situation unfolding on his aircraft. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're returning to the gate to address a serious security situation. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." The plane hadn't even pushed back from the gate yet, making the return swift as ground crew scrambled to reposition the jet bridge. Patricia stood frozen in place, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her as she watched her career, her reputation, and her freedom evaporate in real time. The passengers who had supported her discrimination were now desperately trying to distance themselves from their earlier comments, but the internet never forgets, and their faces were already being identified and shared across social media platforms. Within minutes, airport police boarded the aircraft, their presence transforming the first-class cabin into a crime scene as they approached Patricia with handcuffs visible on their belts. "Patricia Summers, you're under arrest for assault and battery," the lead officer announced, his voice carrying throughout the silent cabin. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Patricia's legs finally gave out completely, and she collapsed into the nearest empty seat, tears streaming down her face as the reality of her situation hit with full force. "Please, Mr. Mitchell," she sobbed into the phone that Amara still held on speaker, "I didn't know who she was. I was just trying to maintain standards in first class. I have a family, a mortgage, children in college." Daniel's response was immediate and unforgiving. "You didn't know who she was? So you would have continued this behavior if she had been any other black mother traveling with her infant? That makes it worse, not better. You've just admitted to systematic discrimination, which opens Atlas Airlines to massive liability. Your employment is terminated immediately, and the company will cooperate fully with federal prosecutors." The officers helped Patricia to her feet, and the click of handcuffs closing around her wrists seemed to echo through the cabin like a judge's gavel falling. As they led her off the aircraft, passengers could see news vans already gathering on the tarmac, alerted by the viral videos that had exploded across social media platforms. The hashtags #AtlasAssault and #CEOJustice were trending nationally within minutes, and Patricia's face was becoming the most recognized image of workplace discrimination in airline history. Amara remained seated throughout the arrest, holding Isaiah close as he finally began to calm down, seeming to sense that the danger had passed. She kissed his forehead gently and whispered soothing words while the cabin around her buzzed with shock and disbelief. Daniel's voice came through the phone again, softer now and filled with concern for his family rather than corporate authority. "Sweetheart, I'm sending our private jet to get you and Isaiah. You don't have to fly commercial today after what you've been through," Daniel said, his love and protectiveness evident in every word. Amara considered for a moment before responding, her voice carrying to every passenger in the first-class cabin who was hanging on every word of this unprecedented drama. "No, Daniel. I think I'll take this flight. These passengers need to see that discrimination doesn't win, that families like ours belong in every space we choose to occupy. But I appreciate you offering." Her dignity and grace in the face of such public humiliation struck the watching passengers like a physical blow, forcing them to confront their own complicity in what had nearly been a terrible injustice. The businessman who had made snide comments earlier stood up slowly, his face red with shame, and approached Amara's seat with obvious discomfort. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology," he said, his voice cracking with emotion as he faced the woman he had dismissed and prejudged. "I made assumptions based on nothing but prejudice, and I supported that flight attendant's horrible behavior. There's no excuse for what I did, and I'm deeply sorry." Amara looked at him for a long moment before nodding slightly, accepting his apology with more grace than he deserved. One by one, other passengers began approaching her seat, offering apologies, assistance, and expressions of support that should have been there from the beginning. The elderly woman who had complained about crying babies was in tears herself now, realizing how her casual cruelty had contributed to an environment where Patricia felt empowered to commit assault. The transformation in the cabin atmosphere was complete, from hostile judgment to humbled recognition of their collective failure to stand against obvious discrimination. A new flight crew boarded the aircraft, led by Chief Flight Attendant Marcus Williams, a veteran employee known for his professionalism and warmth. He approached Amara's seat with genuine concern and respect, kneeling in the aisle to speak with her at eye level rather than standing over her in a position of authority. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm personally horrified by what happened here today, and I want to assure you that this crew will provide you and Isaiah with the service and respect you deserve. Is there anything at all we can do to make your flight more comfortable?" His sincerity was obvious, and Amara found herself finally relaxing slightly for the first time since boarding. "Thank you, Mr. Williams. Isaiah and I just want to travel in peace like any other passengers. Though perhaps some warm milk for his bottle would be helpful when we're airborne." Marcus smiled and nodded, making a note while also ensuring the entire crew understood that this mother and child were to be treated with exceptional care and respect. As the plane prepared for departure again, Daniel's voice came through the phone one more time before Amara ended the call. "I'm watching the flight tracker, and I'll be waiting for you in Chicago. The entire executive team is meeting tomorrow to implement new policies preventing anything like this from ever happening again." Patricia Summers wasn't the first problem, but she's going to be the last. The promise carried weight because everyone listening knew that Daniel Mitchell had the power and determination to make systematic changes that would ripple throughout the entire airline industry. After Amara ended the call, she settled back in her seat with Isaiah, who had finally fallen asleep against her chest, his tiny hand still clutching the edge of his grandmother's blanket. The other passengers in first class were unusually quiet, many of them still processing what they had witnessed and their own role in nearly supporting a terrible injustice. The flight to Chicago proceeded without incident, but it was unlike any flight those passengers had ever experienced. The atmosphere was subdued and reflective, with many people spending the journey writing emails to Atlas Airlines praising Amara's dignity and condemning their own initial reactions. The college student who had been live-streaming the incident had gained 50,000 followers in an hour and was using her platform to educate people about unconscious bias and the importance of standing up against discrimination when you see it happening. By the time they landed in Chicago, Patricia Summers' arrest video had been viewed over 3 million times, and Atlas Airlines stock had dropped 12% in after-hours trading. The financial markets were reacting to what investors recognized as a massive liability crisis, but Daniel Mitchell had already begun implementing the response that would ultimately save and transform the company. The next morning, Daniel held a press conference that was broadcast live on every major news network. Standing beside him was Amara, holding Isaiah, presenting a united front that conveyed both strength and determination. Daniel's statement was comprehensive and unflinching in its honesty about systematic problems within Atlas Airlines and the airline industry as a whole. "Yesterday, my wife was assaulted by an employee who felt empowered to discriminate because she believed the system would protect her. She was right to believe that because we've been protecting employees like Patricia Summers for years through quiet settlements and buried complaints. That ends today." He announced the creation of the Mitchell Family Protocol, a comprehensive reform package that included mandatory anti-discrimination training for all employees, immediate termination for any physical contact with passengers outside of safety emergencies, and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination based on race, age, or family status. The reforms went further than any airline had ever attempted, including the installation of additional cameras in all cabins to ensure complete documentation of crew-passenger interactions, and the establishment of an independent review board for all discrimination complaints that bypassed corporate management entirely. Within weeks, other airlines began adopting similar policies, afraid of facing their own viral incidents that could destroy their reputations and stock values overnight. Patricia Summers' trial became a landmark case in aviation law, with her receiving 18 months in federal prison for assault and civil rights violations. Her conviction sent shockwaves through the industry as flight crews realized that discrimination would no longer be tolerated or quietly resolved. The businessman who had initially supported Patricia became an unexpected advocate for change, using his position as a Fortune 500 executive to implement similar anti-discrimination policies in his own company and speaking publicly about how witnessing Amara's treatment had forced him to confront his own prejudices. 6 months after the incident, Amara accepted an invitation to speak at the International Aviation Summit about her experience and the changes it had sparked. Standing before an audience of airline executives, government regulators, and industry professionals, she spoke with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her behavior during the assault. "I could have responded to violence with violence, to hatred with hatred, but that would have only perpetuated the cycle. Instead, my husband and I chose to use our position and privilege to create systematic change that protects all families traveling through our skies. No parent should ever face discrimination for simply existing in spaces they have every right to occupy." Her speech received a standing ovation, but more importantly, it inspired additional reforms across the global aviation industry. Countries around the world began implementing their own versions of the Mitchell Family Protocol, recognizing that protecting families from discrimination was not just morally right but essential for business success. Isaiah, now a toddler, became an unintentional symbol of the transformation, with his picture appearing in training materials as a reminder that every child deserves to travel with dignity regardless of their race or background. Atlas Airlines created a scholarship program in his name, providing aviation career opportunities for young people from underrepresented communities who might otherwise never have considered careers in the airline industry. The program's first graduate was a young black woman who had watched the viral video of Patricia's arrest and decided she wanted to be part of changing the industry from within. She became a flight attendant for Atlas Airlines and made it her mission to ensure every family felt welcomed and supported during their travels, especially those who might feel vulnerable or marginalized. The ripple effects of that single moment of discrimination continued spreading throughout society, sparking conversations in boardrooms, classrooms, and living rooms about unconscious bias and the importance of standing up against injustice when you witness it. The college student who had live-streamed the incident became a social justice journalist, using her platform to document and expose discrimination in various industries. Her documentary about the Atlas Airlines incident won several awards and became required viewing in many corporate diversity training programs. She interviewed dozens of passengers who had been on the flight, many of whom expressed deep regret about their initial reactions and gratitude for the wake-up call Amara's dignity had provided them. The elderly woman who had complained about crying babies became an unexpected advocate for family-friendly travel policies, writing letters to airlines requesting better accommodations for parents traveling with young children. Daniel Mitchell's transformation of Atlas Airlines became a case study at Harvard Business School, demonstrating how swift, decisive action in response to a crisis could actually strengthen a company's market position and reputation. Within a year of implementing the Mitchell Family Protocol, Atlas Airlines had become the preferred carrier for families, with customer satisfaction scores reaching record highs. The company's stock price not only recovered but exceeded pre-incident levels as investors recognized the value of a truly inclusive corporate culture. Patricia Summers' name became synonymous with the consequences of workplace discrimination, her mugshot appearing in training materials as a cautionary tale of how prejudice and abuse of power could destroy a career in minutes. She served her full sentence and, upon release, found herself unemployable in any customer service field, her name too toxic for any company to risk association. The transformation extended beyond just Atlas Airlines as other industries began examining their own practices and policies regarding discrimination and customer treatment. Retail stores, restaurants, hotels, and other service industries implemented their own versions of the Mitchell Protocol, recognizing that viral incidents could happen anywhere and that preventing discrimination was better than dealing with its aftermath. Law schools began teaching the Atlas Airlines incident as a landmark case in civil rights law, examining how social media and viral videos had created a new form of accountability that bypassed traditional legal channels while ultimately reinforcing them. The federal prosecution of Patricia Summers established precedents that made it easier to prosecute discrimination cases in the future, with video evidence and social media documentation becoming powerful tools for justice. Amara and Daniel established the Dignity in Transit Foundation, using their resources and influence to provide legal support for travelers facing discrimination. The foundation took on hundreds of cases in its first year, achieving a nearly perfect success rate and forcing airlines to pay millions in settlements while implementing policy changes to prevent future incidents. They also created an app that allowed travelers to report discrimination in real time, creating a database that helped identify patterns and problematic employees before situations escalated to violence. The app included resources for bystanders on how to safely intervene when witnessing discrimination, recognizing that silence and inaction were forms of complicity that enabled abuse to continue. The first anniversary of the incident was marked by Atlas Airlines as a day of reflection and renewed commitment to their zero discrimination policy. Daniel stood before employees at the company's annual meeting and reminded them that their success was built on treating every passenger with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance or assumptions about their background. Patricia Summers believed she was protecting standards in first class, but she was actually destroying everything our company should stand for. Every employee who thinks some passengers deserve less respect than others is a liability we cannot afford, morally or financially. The message was clear and uncompromising, creating a culture where discrimination was not just against policy but antithetical to the company's core values and survival. Isaiah grew up traveling frequently with his parents, experiencing a transformed airline industry where families were welcomed and supported rather than judged and discriminated against. His presence on flights often prompted crew members to go above and beyond in their service, not because of who his parents were but because they had internalized the lessons of that fateful day. He became a reminder that every child on every flight deserved compassion and respect, that crying babies were not disruptions but human beings deserving of patience and understanding. The blanket his grandmother had knitted, which had been with him during the assault, was eventually donated to the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture as an artifact representing the ongoing fight for dignity and justice in everyday spaces. The business passengers who had witnessed the incident became some of the most vocal advocates for change in their own organizations, having experienced firsthand how quickly they had been willing to support discrimination when it was packaged as maintaining standards or protecting their comfort. Many of them implemented unconscious bias training in their companies and shared their experience as a cautionary tale about the danger of making assumptions based on appearance. The businessman who had apologized to Amara became a regular speaker at corporate diversity events, using his shame and transformation as a teaching tool for other executives who might harbor similar prejudices. He would always end his presentations with the same message: I was ready to support a woman being thrown off a plane with her baby because I assumed she didn't belong in first class. If I could make that mistake, anyone can, which is why we need systems and accountability to prevent our worst impulses from causing harm. 5 years after the incident, Amara published a memoir about her experience and its aftermath, with proceeds going to support families facing discrimination in public spaces. The book became a bestseller and was adapted into a film that brought the story to an even wider audience, ensuring that the lessons learned that day would not be forgotten. In the book, she reflected on the moment Patricia slapped her and how she had made the conscious choice to respond with dignity rather than violence, knowing that her reaction would determine not just her own outcome but potentially influence how similar situations would be handled in the future. She wrote about the weight of that responsibility and how holding Isaiah had reminded her that she was fighting not just for herself but for every mother who had been judged and dismissed simply for existing in spaces where others thought they didn't belong. The film adaptation included interviews with many of the passengers who had been on the flight, including painful admissions of their own prejudices and how witnessing Amara's treatment had forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. The elderly woman who had complained about crying babies was particularly moving in her interview, tears streaming down her face as she admitted that she had become the kind of person her younger self would have been ashamed of, someone who had let comfort and privilege turn her heart cold to the struggles of others. She had spent the years since the incident volunteering with organizations that Supported young mothers, trying to make amends for her cruelty that day and the countless other times she had likely made parents feel unwelcome in public spaces. Patricia Summers, interviewed from prison, remained largely unrepentant, insisting that she had been trying to maintain professional standards and that the punishment was disproportionate to her actions. Her inability to acknowledge the discrimination at the heart of her behavior served as a powerful reminder that not everyone would learn from consequences, making systematic protections and accountability even more important. Her former colleagues at Atlas Airlines, interviewed anonymously, revealed that Patricia's behavior had been an open secret for years, with multiple complaints from passengers of color that had been dismissed or resolved quietly to avoid controversy. The revelation led to additional investigations and reforms, with several other employees facing termination for similar patterns of discrimination that had been previously overlooked or excused. The transformation of Atlas Airlines inspired business case studies around the world, demonstrating that companies could not only survive but thrive by taking strong stands against discrimination and implementing real accountability measures. Daniel's leadership during the crisis became legendary in corporate circles, with his immediate response and comprehensive reforms setting new standards for executive responsibility. He would often say in interviews that the incident had been both the worst and best day of his professional life, worst because his wife and son had been assaulted by someone under his leadership, and best because it had given him the opportunity and mandate to create real change that would protect countless families in the future. His decision to make the reforms public and transparent, rather than handling things quietly, had transformed a potential corporate disaster into a triumph of accountability and progress. 10 years after the incident, Isaiah, now old enough to understand what had happened, spoke at a youth leadership conference about growing up in the shadow of that viral moment. He talked about how his mother's dignity and his father's decisive action had taught him that privilege came with responsibility, that those with power had an obligation to use it to protect those without it. He announced his intention to study law with a focus on civil rights, wanting to continue the work his parents had started in ensuring equal treatment for all people in all spaces. His speech went viral in its own right, with millions of people moved by the young man who had been the crying baby at the center of a discrimination incident that had changed an entire industry. The Mitchell Family Protocol had evolved over the decade into an international standard, with airlines competing to demonstrate their commitment to family-friendly and discrimination-free travel. What had started as a crisis response had become a selling point, with airlines advertising their adherence to Mitchell standards as a way to attract customers who valued dignity and respect. The financial success of airlines that fully embraced the protocols proved that treating all passengers with respect was not just morally right but economically smart, dispelling the myth that discrimination was somehow necessary for maintaining service quality or profitability. Annual surveys showed that passenger satisfaction had increased across the board, with families particularly noting how much more welcome they felt when traveling. Amara continued her advocacy work, expanding beyond aviation to address discrimination in healthcare, education, and other essential services where prejudice could have devastating consequences. Her foundation had helped thousands of families fight back against discrimination, creating a network of support and legal resources that had previously not existed. She often spoke about how that moment of violence had transformed into a movement for justice, how Patricia's slap had awakened something in society that had been dormant too long. In her speeches, she would hold up a picture of Isaiah from that day, his tiny face scrunched up in tears, and remind audiences that every child deserved to exist in public spaces without their parents being assaulted for their presence. The college student who had live-streamed the incident had become a prominent civil rights attorney, using her platform and legal expertise to fight discrimination in courtrooms across the country. She often credited that day with changing her life's trajectory, transforming her from someone who documented injustice to someone who actively fought against it. Her social media following had grown to millions, and she used it to educate people about their rights and how to recognize and respond to discrimination when they witnessed it. She had also developed training programs for bystander intervention, teaching people how to safely support victims of discrimination without escalating situations to violence. Daniel's transformation of Atlas Airlines had made him a legendary figure in corporate leadership, with his swift and comprehensive response to the crisis becoming the gold standard for executive accountability. He had turned down numerous offers from other companies wanting him to lead their organizations, choosing instead to remain at Atlas Airlines to ensure the reforms remained permanent and continued evolving. Under his leadership, the airline had become the most profitable in the industry while also having the highest employee satisfaction rates, proving that treating both workers and customers with dignity created sustainable success. He often spoke about how seeing his wife assaulted had been the worst moment of his life, but also the catalyst for the most important work he would ever do. The impact of that single moment continued rippling outward, touching lives in ways that could never have been predicted when Patricia Summers raised her hand in anger. Laws had been changed, policies reformed, and countless acts of discrimination prevented because of the precedent set that day. The image of Amara holding Isaiah while maintaining her dignity in the face of assault had become iconic, appearing in museums and textbooks as a symbol of grace under pressure and the power of responding to hatred with principled action rather than reciprocal violence. Students studied the incident in schools across the country, learning about civil rights not as abstract concepts but through the real story of a mother and baby who had faced discrimination and triumphed through dignity and determination. As the years passed, the phrase, "Remember Atlas Airlines," became shorthand in corporate diversity training for the consequences of allowing discrimination to flourish unchecked. Companies across industries implemented their own versions of the Mitchell Protocol, recognizing that viral incidents could happen anywhere and that preventing discrimination was essential for survival in an interconnected world where injustice could be broadcast globally in seconds. The financial implications had been staggering, with companies that failed to address discrimination facing boycotts, lawsuits, and stock price collapses that could destroy decades of building in moments. The business case for diversity and inclusion had never been clearer, with Amara and Isaiah's story serving as both warning and inspiration for corporate leaders worldwide. The transformation wasn't complete, and discrimination hadn't been eliminated entirely, but the aviation industry had undergone a fundamental shift in how it approached customer service and employee accountability. Flight attendants were now trained to see crying babies as opportunities to help rather than problems to solve, and passengers were more likely to offer assistance to struggling parents rather than judgment. The change was generational, with younger employees entering the industry having grown up with the Atlas Airlines incident as a cautionary tale that shaped their understanding of professional responsibility and human dignity. They brought with them different expectations and values, refusing to tolerate the casual discrimination that had once been commonplace in customer service roles. Looking back on that day 20 years later, as Isaiah prepared to argue his first case before the Supreme Court as a civil rights attorney, Amara reflected on how a moment of pain had transformed into a legacy of progress. Patricia Summers had meant to humiliate and exclude them, but instead had created an opportunity for systematic change that protected millions of families from similar treatment. The slap that had echoed through that first-class cabin had reverberated through history, its sound eventually drowning out the voices of discrimination and prejudice that had once felt so powerful and untouchable. In her final interview before retiring from public advocacy, Amara said simply, "Sometimes the worst moments of our lives become the catalyst for our most important work." Patricia Summers gave me a gift that day, though she never intended to. She gave me the opportunity to ensure that no other mother would have to endure what I did, and for that, in a strange way, I'm grateful.